Last week we had 17 quarterbacks score at least 17 fantasy points, and now we're heading into week 17, where I would like to see another 17 do it again, because at this point of the fantasy season, I don't necessarily need my quarterback to win me my championship, I just don't want him to lose it for me. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there. Today we're going to be talking about quarterbacks that we're going to start and sit for week 17 fantasy football. It's championship week for so many people. Now, hopefully you enjoyed your Christmas. We got New Year's right around the corner, but we're trying to take home some fantasy titles. Now, like I said in the opening here of this video, of course, we want quarterbacks to score 25 points a week, but there's not very many that can do that. Given the landscape of fantasy football right now, we just need some solid numbers to carry us to a fantasy championship. We need to try to focus as much as we can on those guys who still have something to play for here in the 2023 season. Teams that are fighting for a chance at not only just the playoffs, but maybe at higher seeds in the playoffs. But with it being championship week, we're not wasting any time. We're diving right into the matchups, kicking it off Thursday Night Football, the New York Jets and Cleveland Browns. And let's go ahead and kick it off here with the Jets and talk about, I'm guessing, Trevor Siemian here once again. Put this into perspective just a little bit. Last week, the Jets scored 30 points for the third time all year long. Siemian, though, barely completed 50% of his passes, had 2 more turnovers, and that was against the Washington Commanders, arguably one of the worst defenses in the NFL. Trevor Siemian now has 5 turnovers to only 1 touchdown over his last 2 weeks played, and now he gets a matchup going up against Cleveland, with Zach Wilson still in concussion protocol, and Cleveland allowing only 14 fantasy points per game, all while Trevor Siemian's averaging like 11. There is no part of me that wants to start Trevor Siemian in my fantasy championship, and I doubt you do either. But what about Joe Flacco? This dude hops straight off the couch and is just balling out in the NFL. Over the last month of the season, in the 4 games that he has played and started, he is the overall quarterback 3 during that span, averaging 21.3 fantasy points per game. He's throwing the ball on average over 42 times a contest, has 10 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, and has now gone over 300 yards passing in 3 of the 4 games he's played. But this may be his toughest matchup yet going up against the Jets. They allow only 13.1 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is the fewest in all of the NFL. And when we look at the overall Browns roster, they got beat up in week 16. They've already had their kicker ruled out here in week 17. I would love to say what we've seen so far from Joe Flacco, we can just continue riding that hot wave, because somewhat of a revenge game. Remember, he was with the Jets just last season. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Flacco goes out there once again and puts up 17 plus fantasy points. But Cleveland has a 99% chance of making the playoffs as of right now with their 10 wins. They don't need to force too much. They don't want to risk having more injuries going into the playoff season. So for that reason, Joe Flacco going to be a little bit more riskier than maybe he would be if we were talking about this game 2 or 3 weeks earlier. Which will then bring us to our one game on Saturday, the Dallas Cowboys and Detroit Lions. And for Jared Goff, not a whole lot of negative for Jared Goff. If I had to pick one thing, it's what we saw in week 16. At times, this running game is so dominant and good in Detroit that they don't really have to force the passing game. That's going to limit the ceiling of Jared Goff from time to time, but he's playing just fine. He's the overall quarterback 8 in fantasy football, averaging 18 fantasy points per game, and has only scored under 14 fantasy points 4 times all year long. Now he gets a matchup going up against Dallas, and that's not going to be an easy one by any means, but as of late, this Dallas defense has struggled, albeit against the likes of Buffalo and Miami. But just because you hear the name Detroit Lions doesn't mean that they shouldn't belong in that same mix with the Buffaloes and the Miamis. Right now, Detroit is a top 5 offense in all major categories. Like I said, they're up there. They belong in the same category of Buffalo and Miami. And Dallas, even though they only allow 15.7 fantasy points per game, like I said, they've been vulnerable here as of late. The Lions have already won and clinched their division. They're in the playoffs, but the number 1 seed is still up for grabs in the NFC. Right now, they're tied with San Francisco, which is crazy to even think about. But we also know that it's easier to run on Dallas than it is to throw on Dallas, so I have to think that Detroit is going to run again, which will once again limit that ceiling of Jared Goff. However, he's still going to be a Verge top 12 play for me in week 17. How about Dak Prescott? We saw a solid bounce back last week in Week 16 against Miami. He scored over 18 fantasy points for the 7th time in his last 10 games played. He's the overall quarterback 3 in fantasy football, averaging over 20 fantasy points per game, and one of only 4 quarterbacks this year to have scored over 300 fantasy points. The other 3, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and Lamar Jackson. That's pretty good company to be in. Now, people can have all the team bias that they want to. They can look at the Cowboys, they can call them frauds. It doesn't really matter. I don't care about that. The only thing we all care about is fantasy points and touchdown score fantasy points. In the last 9 games, Dak has 25 touchdowns. Now a matchup going up against Detroit. They allow 19.2 fantasy points per game. That's 7th most in the NFL. This run game still can't get anything going in Dallas, so they're going to have to continue to throw the ball. It's a home game in Dallas. Plus, the Cowboys still have a very slim chance of getting that number 1 overall seed in the NFC. And this game being played on Saturday means that they're going to play before Philadelphia, so Dallas has to go out and try to win this ball game. Dak's going to be a top 10 play. Which will then bring us to one of the matchups I'm looking forward to the most this weekend, the Miami Dolphins and Baltimore Ravens. Now for Tua and Miami, we just can't seem to get this Miami offense fully healthy. Whether it's Devon Achane, Tyreek Hill, now Jalen Waddle, it's really limited the overall ceiling of this offense. Tua only has 2 touchdowns over the last 3 games combined, and that's not what we need right here in the fantasy playoffs, especially since it sounds like he's going to be without Jalen Waddle rest of the regular season with a high ankle sprain. We add in the fact that this is on the road where the Dolphins typically don't play as well. Plus, it's going against Baltimore. They allow only 13.7 fantasy points per game. That is 3rd fewest in the NFL, and the risk continues to climb here once again for Tua, especially since we just saw what Baltimore did against San Francisco. What really makes this game the most interesting to me, though, is this is a matchup of the number 1 and number 2 overall teams in the AFC right now. If Baltimore wins this matchup, they clinch the number 1 overall seed. If Miami wins, it'll be tied, and it will all come down to the games in Week 18, and those are the most fun to watch, especially since I'm going to be in Miami to watch the Dolphins play the Bills. However, Tua's going to be a little bit lower in my rankings here this week, a little bit more of a boom or bust type option. His opponent, Lamar Jackson. So everything I just said when talking about Tua, the fact that this is a home game for Baltimore and a game in which they can clinch the number 1 overall seed in the AFC, you have the potential NFL MVP, the current quarterback 4 overall in fantasy football, who's averaging over 20 fantasy points per game and is only 214 yards rushing away from yet another 1,000-yard rushing season. Going up against Miami, they allow 16.2 fantasy points per contest, but we just saw Dak hang 18 on him last week. No other new injuries in this offense. I see another top 5 ranking this week once again for Lamar Jackson. Which will then take us out to Buffalo for the Bills and the New England Patriots. We'll start off with Bailey Zappi, and I'll give credit where credit is due. Zappi had another solid game in Week 16. He's now scored 16 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games played, but both of those games were on the road against Pittsburgh and Denver. Now he gets to go on the road again against Buffalo, but Buffalo allows only 15.2 fantasy points per game. That's 7th fewest in the league. Plus, we still have a lot of injuries in this offense. Guys like Hunter Henry, Juju, Ramondre Stevenson, we know has been perma-questionable second half of the season. Pair that with the fact that the New England Patriots have nothing to play for, and the Bills haven't quite yet even clinched a playoff spot. I'm not going to risk it here with Bailey Zappi on the road in Buffalo. As for Josh Allen, no need to overthink this one. I think everyone is going to start Josh Allen, the overall quarterback 1 in fantasy football, averaging 24 fantasy points per game, and is scoring 20-plus points a week without even throwing the damn ball to Stephon Diggs. Imagine if they can figure that out once again. The ceiling is only going to get higher. In a matchup going up against New England, solid defense. They allow 15.4 fantasy points per game as well. That's 9th fewest in the NFL. But dang it, we all need to come together and form a prayer circle because we need this rushing upside to continue for Josh Allen. If it wasn't for that rushing upside, he would have absolutely killed teams the past couple of weeks because he only has a total of 36 pass attempts over the last 2 games combined. But it's the rushing touchdowns in all but 4 games this year that continue to raise that floor, and it's why he's so safe to start. Which will then take us out to Chicago for the Bears and the Falcons. For Taylor, give me a Heineke. he's not playing bad, right? I'm not going to come on here and bash Taylor Heinicke, but this passing offense of Atlanta, the ceiling is just so low no matter what. They only have one game all year long in which they've had multiple touchdown passes by a quarterback. Add in the fact they played better at home this game, not at home, on the road in Chicago, and that defense in Chicago has forced 14 turnovers over their last 4 games. Chicago allows 17 fantasy points per game, but Heinicke's ceiling is right around 15 max, maybe a top 24 option in one of those 2 quarterback league or super flex leagues, but not any higher for me this week. As for Justin Fields, I really view him as one of those fantasy options that I'm willing to risk it with each and every week. His floor has been super solid, and his ceiling is matchup winning. He's had at least 15 fantasy points in 7 of the 11 games he's played this season, and has gone over 21 fantasy points in 5 of those games. He's also had 50-plus yards rushing or a touchdown in 4 of the last 5 games he's played as well. Now a matchup going up against Atlanta. They allow 16.7 fantasy points per game. We are watching Cole Kmet. He is questionable at this time to play in this ball game, but how crazy is it that in week 17, technically the Bears aren't mathematically eliminated just yet? Sure, the chances of them making the playoffs, it's not gonna, I'm sorry, Bears fan, it's not gonna happen, but with the way the season started, the fact that they're not already eliminated, pretty crazy, and I'm gonna have Justin Fields once again inside my top 12. Which will then bring us out to Houston for the Texans and the Titans. We'll kick it off with Ryan Tannehill, Will Levis, Malik Willis. It doesn't matter who starts in Tennessee. None of them are going to be an option for us in our fantasy championship. I wouldn't start any of them if they were 100% healthy and we knew for sure who it was going to be. Then you add in the fact that we could see multiple quarterbacks in this game. I have zero interest. I don't care how great the matchup is going up against Houston. Yeah, sure, they allow 19 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but the quarterbacks in Tennessee don't score 19 points a game, so I'm not overly worried about it. I'm not considering anybody in Tennessee. As for Houston, all fingers are crossed that we see CJ Stroud return this week. As of right now, at the time of this recording, he is still technically questionable to play. But I'm really not interested if it's going to be Case Keenum or Davis Mills, whatever that revolving door turns out to be here. It's 100% CJ Stroud or nothing for me here in Houston. These two teams just played a couple of weeks ago. In that game, Houston won it in overtime behind Case Keenum. And really, Tennessee isn't a bad defense. They allow 15.7 fantasy points per game. But with the running game we've seen so far here over the past few weeks in Houston, paired up with Nico Collins now, Noah Brown, Dalton Schultz back in the lineup, we could see another huge week from CJ Stroud if he's 100% healthy. If he is, he'll be back inside my top 12. Which will then take us out to Indy for the Colts and the Raiders. And for the Raiders, they're coming off a game in which they just beat the Kansas City Chiefs 20-14. In that game, though, Aiden O'Connell had 62 yards passing and no touchdowns. That is like the floor of all floors. So let's go ahead and keep it real here. This guy has had one really good game all season long, and it came against one of the worst pass defenses in all of the NFL. In his other 8 games, he has a total of 5 touchdowns. Going up against Indianapolis, they allow right around 15.7 fantasy points per game, but with only 2 touchdowns total on the road this season, I'm not going to risk it with Aiden O'Connell. How about Minshew Mania? Now, Minshew is another one of those quote-unquote safer starts. He scored at least 15 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games played. The problem is, he's only gone over 15 fantasy points 3 times all year long. He is a stereotypical quarterback 2 in Superflex or 2 QB leagues. He's not going to lose you a week, but he's probably not going to win you one either, especially in a matchup like this that is not going to be easy. The Raiders defense is still very underrated. They allow 15.6 fantasy points per game and have played much better second half of the season, and we really saw them get after and limit Patrick Mahomes just last week. When it comes to Gardner Minshew, more of a top 15 to 18 play. Which then brings us down to Jacksonville for the Jags and the Panthers. And for Bryce Young, coming off probably his best game overall of the entire season. His first 300-yard passing game of the season, and his second game this year with multiple touchdown passes. Listen, this kid does not suck, but the team and the organization does. After everything we've seen in Carolina this entire season, where we haven't wanted to start Bryce Young one time, are we really going to consider it in our fantasy championship? No, we're not. Even though this matchup is delicious. The Jags allow 20 fantasy points per game, third most in the NFL. Typically, you want to start your quarterbacks against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, for me in fantasy football, that is not the case, but maybe this kid can build a little bit of momentum and carry it into 2024. He's just not going to be somebody that I trust to bring home my fantasy championship in week 17. On the other side, Trevor Lawrence. And does anyone else watch this Jags offense and just get confused? Last week, we know no Christian Kirk, no Zay Jones, and then you go the entire first half and ignore Calvin Ridley with the exception of some stupid rush attempt where he loses 12 yards. And then you come out in the second half and you see Calvin Ridley put in work and wonder, why didn't you do that to start the game? It's too many weird questions like that have really held the Jags back in 2023. Plus, Trevor Lawrence continues to turn the ball over way too much for the amount of touchdowns he's scoring anyway. But all of that aside, now he's dealing with a right shoulder injury, and the Jags just brought in Matt Barkley. And if you want to make matters even worse, this is not a great matchup whatsoever. Going up against Carolina, they allow 13.4 fantasy points per game. That is second lowest in the NFL. They're better at limiting quarterbacks than the likes of Cleveland and Baltimore. Now, there is a chance that Zay Jones could be back this week, and the Jags are still fighting for a playoff/division title. But given the inconsistent play, the matchup, the injury concerns, even if Trevor Lawrence does play, he'll be a mid-quarterback 2 at best, somebody ranked right around quarterback 15 to 18. But now we go back to New York for the Giants and the Los Angeles Rams. And for Matthew Stafford and this Rams overall offense, the turnaround we've seen from them second half of the season is absolutely incredible. Matthew Stafford didn't have one top 12 finish at the position for the first 11 weeks of the season. Since then, 5 straight top 12 finishes. You want more? How about this? The first 11 weeks of the season, Matthew Stafford only had one game with multiple touchdown passes. Since then, 5 straight games with multiple touchdowns. The overall quarterback 2 in fantasy football over the last 5 weeks of the season. Now a matchup going up against New York, they allow over 16.5 fantasy points per game. This Rams team is still fighting for a playoff spot and their offense is red hot. Matthew Stafford going to be back up inside my top 12 once again. How about Tommy DeVito? It's one of those situations I'm not even going to consider in New York. DeVito getting benched, Tyrod playing decent, the Giants already being eliminated. This could be another one of those games with a revolving door of quarterbacks that I'm not going to trust in championship week. There's then brings out to Philly for a couple of no-brainers between the Eagles and the Cardinals. Start off with Kyler Murray, and really, a lot of people questioned why I had Kyler Murray ranked so high last week on the road against Chicago, but we really saw why. This Arizona team is going to be trailing and Kyler Murray has rushing upside. That is like the perfect equation for garbage points. Now sure, they may not be pretty on the field, but I'll take garbage points into fantasy points because that's what wins fantasy matchups. We're trying to find quarterbacks that have to keep their foot on the pedal all 4 quarters, and that's kind of what Kyler Murray has to do. He's averaging 18 fantasy points per game this season, and 3 of the 6 games he's played in has resulted in over 20 fantasy points. Now a matchup going up against Philly, they allow 21 fantasy points per game, second most in the NFL. You know, once again, the Arizona Cardinals are going to be losing and having to throw the ball all 4 quarters once again. More than likely, when my rankings come out end of week, I'm probably going to have Kyler Murray higher than most because they just continue to ignore the facts. How about Jalen Hurts? Pretty much a no-brainer, right? Hurts against the Arizona Cardinals. He's the overall quarterback too, averaging over 23 fantasy points per game, and he has finished as a top 12 quarterback in 87% of his games this season. Then on top of all of that, it's a great matchup going up against Arizona. This is exactly what this team in Philadelphia could use to try to fix their passing game struggles. And with him scoring rushing touchdowns what feels like almost weekly, it's really hard to ever sit Jalen Hurts. Arizona allows 19 fantasy points per game, and the Eagles are fighting for that #1 overall spot in the NFC. It's a no-doubter we're starting Jalen Hurts. Which will then bring us out to Tampa for the Bucs and the Saints. We'll start off with Derek Carr because does anyone else out there besides me feel like we're being set up for Derek Carr to sweep the leg? This guy has played great in back-to-back weeks, actually has 8 touchdowns over his last 3 games played, and now he gets a matchup that we always want to start opposing quarterbacks against in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who allow 19 fantasy points per game. We know Olave is going to be out there, Rashid Shaheed's going to be out there. Everything is saying that Derek Carr should be someone we consider in week 17. But Carr faced off against this same defense back in week 4, only had 127 yards passing and no touchdowns. I cannot put Derek Carr up inside my top 12, but he's not going to be too far outside of it either. We have seen too many times this season Derek Carr go out and lay an egg. He's not someone that we can look at and be like, oh yeah, his floor is super safe. He's like Russell Wilson this year. He should definitely, at least he's going to score you 15. We can't say that about Derek Carr, and that's why I'm going to have him a little bit lower. On the other side, we got Baker Mayfield, and the damn Bake Show is having the best year of his career, and I am here for it. The overall quarterback 11 in fantasy football. He's now scored at least 19 fantasy points in 6 of his last 9 games played. He's thrown multiple touchdowns in 7 of his last 9 games played, and the last time he faced the Saints, he had 246 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, an interception, and 30 yards rushing. Plus, Marshawn Lattimore is still on the IR, so we shouldn't have to worry too much about Mike Evans. New Orleans, they allow only 15.3 fantasy points per game, though they are a solid defense, but overall the offense in Tampa Bay is healthy. Take all that into account and then add in the fact that Tampa Bay could clinch the division with a win at home. Baker Mayfield's going to be a low-end quarterback 1 for me in week 17. Which then brings out to Washington for the Commanders and the San Francisco 49ers. Let's start off with Brock Purdy. Because it's funny how everyone can talk about how he's an MVP candidate when he's playing well. Then he has a bad game against one of the best teams in the NFL, and people want to hop on the bandwagon and say, oh, dude's a fraud. That has to be one of the dumbest things I've ever heard about high-end players in the NFL. I'm going to just ignore the fact that he had 13 good games because he had 2 bad games. That is really flawed logic in those arguments. But he's going to have a chance to redeem himself this week going up against Washington because they allow over 21 fantasy points per game, the most in the NFL to opposing quarterbacks. Now, a couple injuries to watch for. Offensive tackle Trent Williams, arguably one of, if not the best offensive lineman in the NFL, is dealing with a groin injury. Plus, Brock Purdy himself left the game early in week 16 with a shoulder stinger. However, Shanahan has already come out and said, listen, he should be good to go. I expect him to play. I'm not overthinking it here. It's a great matchup. The dude's going to be up inside my top 10 once again in a great matchup, fighting for the number 1 seed. I'm not scared of Brock Purdy. Now, what I am scared of is the other side of the football because Sam Howell, I don't even know if he's got a job at this point, which is crazy considering what he did earlier in the season. The fact that here we are recording this show on a Tuesday and Washington says they're going to name a starter later in the week, that should just be enough for us to ignore this situation altogether. They have nothing to play for in Washington. The matchup sucks going up against San Francisco. You got Chase Young in a revenge game. The offense in Washington hasn't done much in weeks. This has just been a downward spiral in Washington, and we're not touching any of it when it comes to the quarterback position. Which will then take us out to Seattle for the Seahawks and the Steelers. And does anyone else kind of look at this matchup and kind of just like turn their head to the side like they're a dog that hears a word that it knows and then immediately feel like you have the urge of diarrhea? I mean, Mason Rudolph had a great week in week 16, but don't no one out there in fantasy football land want to start him in week 17. Now, going up against Seattle, it's not a bad matchup. They allow over 17 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. But what if he struggles this week and Kenny Pickett is available? Does he make an appearance at some point in this game? I mean, the Steelers' playoff chances right now are on life support. More than likely, they ain't gonna make it. And what about what we just saw last week from George Pickens? We've all known that this is what he's capable of all year long. However, Pittsburgh only does it like once a month. I saw an interesting stat earlier about George Pickens. 31% of his fantasy points have come on 1% of his snaps. So sure, he's a big play type of guy. But so is Gabe Davis. And a lot of people don't want to start Gabe Davis because we're so reliant on big plays that don't happen consistently. The matchup doesn't suck, but I'm not starting Mason Rudolph. But what about Geno? On the other hand, he reclaimed this job once again after coming off of injury, got a win in week 16, and now a must-win game at home to keep their playoff hopes alive against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And really, Geno hasn't been playing bad. He has back-to-back starts with multiple touchdown passes, which is great. And we already know this offense is full of big playmakers. They would love to try to keep this momentum going in Seattle. In a matchup going up against Pittsburgh, they allow 15.5 fantasy points per game, but by no means are they some shutdown defense right now. Plus, we know Seattle plays way better at home than they do on the road. In a must-win game, Geno is going to be a top 15 option for me here in Week 17. Which then brings us out to Denver for the Broncos, and the Chargers will kick it off with Easton Stick in LA, and we've seen him now in 3 ball games. 2 of those games resulted in 0 touchdown passes. One of those games was against this Denver Broncos team, a game in which he came in for an injured Justin Herbert. I don't hate Easton Stick. He actually has a pretty solid rushing upside. He just hasn't used it very much since he's taken over this job. He's more of a top 20 play weekly, more of a quarterback 2 option than he is some top 12 option. On the road against Denver, Keenan Allen currently questionable, but Denver does allow 18 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Now, technically, Denver has not been eliminated from the playoffs either. Their chances are basically slim to none as well, but they still do have something to play for. I can't put Easton Stick inside the top 12, but he will be a top 20 guy. What about Russell Wilson? Russell, I will put him in the top 12 potentially, and I'll tell you why here. This dude has been one of the most consistent quarterbacks all season long. Only 3 games all year, under 15 fantasy points scored. He's also had multiple touchdowns now in 3 straight games, and the last time he faced off against this Chargers team a couple weeks ago, had 224 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. The Chargers, they allow 20 fantasy points per game, 4th most in the NFL. The biggest question mark here for me is the availability of Courtland Sutton. He's currently in concussion protocol, and would love to have him available. Now, if we have Sutton out there on Sunday, Russ going to be inside my top 12. If for whatever reason Courtland Sutton does not play and he is ruled out, Russ probably going to drop to like a top 15 option. Which will then bring us to Sunday Night Football, the Cincinnati Bengals, Kansas City Chiefs, and for Jake Browning, unfortunately, Jake Browning without Jamar Chase isn't some super high ceiling guy, but he still is a viable quarterback 2 out there in 2 quarterback leagues. Even in a bad game last week, a game in which he threw 3 interceptions, he still scored over 16 fantasy points. Honestly, I'm a little bit more concerned with this matchup here than I am the weapons that he has available. Because this Chiefs defense is one of the best in the NFL. Can you imagine where the Chiefs would be without their defense here this year? They allow 14.5 fantasy points per game. That's 5th fewest in the league to opposing quarterbacks. But this defense overall is top 3 in the league in passing yards per game and defensive points allowed. The Bengals are in must-win territory, though. They have to win this ball game to have any potential shot. In fact, with this game being played Sunday night, they may already know what their destiny holds by the time this game kicks off. But being on the road in Kansas City against a desperate team with a great defense, it's going to keep Jake Browning down there in that top 15 to 20 quarterback range. But what about Patrick Mahomes? And honestly, this is probably the worst overall offense we've ever seen being led by Patrick Mahomes. But the guy, from a fantasy perspective, is still averaging almost 19 fantasy points per game and is the overall quarterback 7 on the season. He's had at least 17.7 fantasy points in 4 of the last 5 games played. It's just the big games. It's those 20-point plus games that we're just not seeing here consistently in 2023. Now, a matchup going up against Cincinnati, they allow 18.6 fantasy points per game. This run game and offensive line are banged up in Kansas City, so they're going to have to throw the ball a lot in Week 17 to get a win. It may not be pretty, and everyone at this point basically hates Patrick Mahomes because he's not out there scoring 20 plus. However, he's still a weekly top 10 option. Which then only leaves us Monday Night Football. The Green Bay Packers, Minnesota Vikings will kick it off with Green Bay. And listen, I am still a Jordan Love truther, but at some point, this dude needs to stop losing some weapons, otherwise he's going to be in some big-time trouble. We know Christian Watson is always hurt. Jaden Reed is hurt. And now Dontavian Wicks is hurt as well. Now, so far on the year, Love is up to quarterback 6 overall, averaging right around 19 fantasy points per game, and has scored over 17 fantasy points in 5 of the last 6 games he's played. Now, a matchup going up against Minnesota, not a cakewalk. They allow 15.9 fantasy points per game, but in their last matchup, Jordan Love had 229 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. While the matchup isn't great, I'm more concerned with having healthy weapons to throw it to. I can't put him inside my top 12 if he's not going to have Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, or Dontavian Wicks. He needs to have at least 2 solid options in this offense that are healthy. If he gets it, great. He's going to be inside my top 12. If he can't, probably going to be more of a top 15 to 18 option. Which then only leaves us Nick Mullens of the Minnesota Vikings. And this kid, kind of fantasy viable with all the weapons he has in Minnesota, right? Even though he could be without a couple of them. TJ Hawkinson, now done for the year with a torn ACL, but not just TJ. Jordan Addison, he suffered an ankle injury last week in week 16 and is currently questionable to play. Now, I love Justin Jefferson, but without Addison and Hawk, the ceiling could be extremely low for Nick Mullens. Now, we all know that Green Bay is easier to run on than they are to throw on. They do allow 16 fantasy points per game, though, to opposing quarterbacks, and we just saw Bryce Young look like a Pro Bowler against them last week. All this really does is come down to injuries. Now, of course, I don't dislike KJ Osborne. Him and Justin Jefferson gives Nick Mullens a decent floor, but if we're looking for ceiling, I would love to have Jordan Addison out there as well. If Addison is out there, Mullens is verge top 12. If he's not, probably in that 15 to 18 range again. All right, that's going to do it for my quarterback start and sit video here for week 17. Hopefully I was able to give you some information to get your brain turned. And don't forget, though, our rankings will still be out Thursday morning prior to Thursday Night Football. Now, if you're one of the rare few that have a championship game in week 18 next week, don't worry, we're going to have videos next week for you as well. We're not just about the masses here. We're about everyone in this community, so don't worry. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day. And then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Nah.